So then the word was sort of gotten to Lee Hogan that the decision would be made over Thanksgiving holidays. Thanksgiving was Thursday, November the 24th. And George Bush was going to be at Camp David. And actually, all the White House people told me that Margaret Thatcher was going to be at Camp David and that Margaret Thatcher and George Bush were going to be planning how they were going to deal and talk to Gorbachev at that Malta meeting coming up. Now, I wanted to check the date of this, so I looked at the New York Times, assuming it would say, you know, Margaret Thatcher arrives. There was not a word in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the London Times anywhere along there that Margaret Thatcher was in the United States meeting with Bush at Camp David. But 3 or 4 of the people involved in the decision later told me that it took place that the Friday after Thanksgiving, at the end of the day, after Bush had been talking to Margaret Thatcher, he privately made the decision. And that Sunday, someone from the White House leaked it to Lee Hogan, saying it's not going to be announced yet, but you're going to be pleased with the news. Now, all thing I can guess is either all the people at the White House misremembered Margaret Thatcher being there, or her being here was kept secret. But it just does kind of puzzle me that Margaret Thatcher could be in the United States 2 or 3 days and that neither the Washington Post, New York Times, London Times ever mentioned it. Does that seem puzzling to you? So I actually went back and said, are you sure that's the right date? Because I don't see any evidence that she was in the United States. That basically said, trust us. So I guess she was there. So on December the 1st, an official announcement was made that this economic summit would be coming to Houston. And Ambassador Fred Malek, M-A-L-E-K, was appointed ambassador in charge of the summit. Well, Houston papers, we've got it. The summit coming to Houston, and the people at Rice we were proud. It's going to be coming. What are we going to do? And then Malek came down, December the 14th. He comes to Houston, and he says, "Well, we haven't picked a specific site yet. We're just coming to Houston." And everybody in Houston was sort of stunned, and all the Rice officials were sort of stunned, maybe even irked. What do you mean? And he said, no, we've decided to come to Houston. We haven't at all determined that it's going to be at Rice. And he said he had some concerns about the Rice campus. He hadn't been to the Rice campus. Now, I think what's happening here is that Malek was just simply letting everybody know that he was now in charge. And so he was sort of acting as though we haven't decided this yet until I check it out and make sure. But also it's possible that he wanted, since he was in charge, if things didn't work right, he'd be the person blamed. So he may have really wanted to make sure. And so he talked about coming down and, he looked at the Rice buildings, and no one at Rice, the White House had never said how many rooms we need or what shape rooms, what size rooms, what kind of facilities. So no one at Rice particularly knew what to show him. So when he came to the campus, he kind of got a campus tour. But the tour was not specific in the sense that you could have a meeting here, because the White House had never said we need this many rooms, this size. It was just sort of, they probably didn't know. And so he says, handsome campus, I don't know if it's going to work. He said, and he began to look and see if he could find maybe some skyscrapers in downtown Houston in which you could find 2 or 3 contiguous empty floors. If you remember Houston in 1990, you could have found, 1,000 empty floors of, so that was a kind of a scary thing. I mean, clearly there are a lot of empty skyscrapers. And so he went back to Washington, and the people at Rice, people at Houston were sort of nonplussed, because they had simply assumed, they had said Rice, and Malek says we're not sure. So then finally the White House, after 2 or 3 urgings, sent a letter laying out some specifics. Now it turned out the specifics were wrong, but nevertheless it did say we need X number of rooms of this size and so forth. So January the 18th, Malek returns, and this time, having had a letter from the White House saying what we like, Rice was able to show very specifically the kinds of rooms and persuade Malek that Rice was the place. So on January 25th, Malek announces that it will be at Rice. Let me read you a little quote of what he says. With the summit working sessions at Rice, he said, the leaders will be able to meet in a relaxed and distinguished environment surrounded by the beautiful campus setting. It says that the Rice setting allows these leaders to do what they need to do, have a series of frank discussions in a dignified but relaxed atmosphere. Rice represents everything good about Houston. It's known worldwide academically and is set in photogenic grounds of impressive buildings and beautiful oak trees. I mean, sounds like somebody at Rice wrote that for him, you know. Just say, sounds wonderful. Okay, so finally, the summit is in Houston. I'm sorry, I have a raspy throat tonight. All of a sudden, if people on the Rice campus, you remember that, there was sort of a sense of exaltation, and then kind of a sinking feeling. Oh my goodness, there are going to be 5,000 journalists here, people all over the world. And it's just like it's your home, you know. If I might come home someday and there are papers on the sofa and whatever, you know. But if I called Nancy and said, you know, President Bush is coming tonight, you can imagine the flurry of activity to get the house cleaned up. Well, that was kind of, you know, oh my goodness alive, we've got to get this campus in ship shape. And you know, that means painting and planning and putting in grass and thinking about landscape, and goodness gracious, Rice had the good sense to sign a contract with the White House saying that the White House would have the campus as is. And they could do anything they wanted to do to it, but when they got finished, they had to put it back the way it was. Or at least it had to be as good, if not better, than it was. And they also agreed that while much of Rice activity would go on, the laboratories, and so people could still feed their animals and whatever, and the library would be open for much of the time, but when the summit time got close, from Saturday 6 p.m. until Thursday noon of the summit week, the heart of the campus, that considered the President's House, Leavitt Hall, the Academic Quadrangle, including the library, Herring Hall, and the 6 colleges south, you know, Baker and Will Rice and so forth, and much of the parking lot, the stadium parking lot, that would become federalized territory. We even actually tried to talk to the White House about guaranteeing that if, for any reason, someone blew up the campus, that we could be reimbursed. We didn't get an actual promise of that, but we were more or less satisfied that if terrorists did blow up the campus, it would be federal property, and the federal government would be obliged to, after all, as is, put it back the way it was. And for that period of time, that part of the campus became federal territory. That is, Rice gave up any kind of control, as did the Houston police force and so forth, and it came under control of a sort of a combination of the FBI and the President's security force, the Secret Service and so forth, and a whole variety of sort of super secret security people. Okay, so we've got the economic summit, and the first thing to do is to start washing and scrubbing. And, you know, it's just amazing for several months. They had high-pressure hoses, and those vaults, they got all cleaned up. And I mean, the campus never looked so pretty. And everything looked spick and span. And then, shortly after it was announced it came to Houston, those tall cypress trees began turning brown. Because in December, there had been an abnormally cold freeze. It got down like to 14. And it took a while, but about the time Malik said the summit's coming to Houston, the cypress trees began to die. And everybody just panicked, and we can't have dead trees. And then they all of a sudden tried to see if we could buy a bunch of tall cypress trees, and discovered they had just built some huge, you know, poor taste gambling casino in Las Vegas and had bought up all the tall cypress trees. So we were panicked. So we were finally able to buy a bunch of cypress trees that were not as tall as we wanted, but at least we had cypress trees. And then they realized that in order for them to live, we had to put in all kinds of special drain, because sometimes the soil was too wet and then they would die of sort of a root rot, and sometimes it was too dry, and so we had to put in an underground drainage system, so if it was too wet, we can drain water off. And then we had a sprinkler system, so there was just this frenetic activity in January and March to get these trees planted and the plumbing put in, dirt covered up, and the sod back on, because, you know, famous people are coming for lunch. And then the White House sent down a group of young people, all of whom, this seemed quite novel in 1990, all of them had portable phones, which came to be just sort of obnoxious, everybody on campus. And they walked around the campus, and they were kept talking about photo opportunities, because it quickly became aware to everybody that the Rice campus was going to be like a movie set. And there are going to be a bunch of young people coming down, and it's going to be just everything is going to be choreographed. They're going to be told where to stand and where to turn and what to say. And everything's going to be determined by when is the sun just right, when are the shadows wrong, and so forth. And they actually pick out 5 or 6 events and stops that are going to be called photo opportunities. And one photo opportunity will be, this is just east of Sewell, those little magnolia trees you see. And they decided that there wasn't enough greenery there. And in fact, they needed not just green, but they needed some really dark green. They needed some magnolia trees. So they came in and drilled holes, and they planted 3 or 4 magnolia trees there, because they would be taking pictures there. And the heads of state, heads of delegation, when they first arrived, after having a photo op, would then walk by there to Cohen House. And they thought that that little grass on each side of the sidewalk there was insufficiently forested. So they planted 4 or 5 magnolia trees. Then they realized that, well, this is summertime, and the Economic Summit, they all will arrive on Monday, and they'll start sort of formally coming to campus a little before 1 o'clock. And they'll all sort of be here a little after 2. And I'll describe in some detail how they do, but they're going to come out through go around the east side of Lovett Hall, through the Sally Port, and they'll walk down toward the statue. And they're going to build a kind of a little reviewing stand. And the heads of the delegation will get up on this reviewing stand for 8 minutes, because they realize this is July and it's 2:15 Houston. So they'll be on this reviewing stand for 8 minutes, in which Bush will give a little talk about 2 minutes. And then they kind of, you know, flags go by and so forth. And then they're going to turn around and walk back into Lovett Hall. So they want to build this reviewing stand, but they began to fear that even though they put a roof on it, a canopy, it's going to be really hot. So they break through the concrete out there, and this is sort of halfway between Willie's statue and Lovett Hall. They break through and they dig a hole through the sidewalk there, and they put in a 10-ton air conditioner. Before it can be installed, it has to be completely disassembled, and then the Secret Service looks at it and reassembles it to make certain that no one puts an explosive inside the air conditioning unit under this reviewing stand. You see, that would be bad. And so those little things right there are going to be the vents where the 10 tons of air conditioning are going to be blowing up cold air. And the heads of delegation are going to be standing right behind that. So there's going to be blowing up. And yes, it is true that they realized that Margaret Thatcher, being a woman and not probably wearing a pantsuit, they actually arranged to have lead sewn into the hem of her skirt. So when the cold air blew up, there wouldn't be one of those sort of Marilyn Monroe effects. And then, of course, they began to carpet this with kind of carpet that made it look sort of regal. And at the very last minute, they weren't sure about putting a canopy on top. And Sunday afternoon, someone said, oh, yes, we ought to have a summit, a roof. And Rice had asked a series of hardware stores and lumber houses to be open 24 hours just because they knew there'd be last-minute requests. So they quickly began putting this up. Of course, it had to be high enough that it doesn't get in the way of the TV cameras. And the poles have to be big enough so that you can get so you see, everything is a photo op. So you're going to have a roof, but it's got to be up so it doesn't get in the, it doesn't make a shadow, it doesn't get in the way of the cameras and so forth. And you notice that that little banister is about 3 feet high, and it's got that blue curtain around that banister. Behind that banister is a 1/8 thick piece of metal. That's a very hardened metal that's impervious to any kind of bullets. So the deal was, if all of a sudden, when the 8 heads of delegation are standing in the air-conditioned little room there for the 8 minutes, if terrorists came along, they would all simply fall on the floor, and they'd be behind that 30-inch tall bulletproof metal sheet, and would be safe. Now, that's some of the outdoor preparations. And they realized that the actual meetings will be in a series of rooms on the Rice campus. Now, this is how it's going to work. And again, I'll do this in more detail later. They're going to arrive Monday afternoon, and there's going to be then they're going to come out in that little reviewing stand, and there's going to be a military parade, and the howitzer's going to shoot some, shots, and there's going to be colonial troops marching around, drum and fife, that kind of stuff, and then a little 8-minute deal. Then they turn around, they march back in, and the heads of delegation are going to go in Lovett Hall up to the Founders Room. And the Founders Room is going to be fixed up with a nice table. In fact, the table in the Founders Room, and there are going to be 2 tables in the library. Those 3 tables cost $315,000. But the nice table is going to be in the O'Connor Reading Room, and that table was $175,000. Anyway, so Monday afternoon, the heads of delegation will meet for about an hour and a half in the Founders Room. And then the foreign ministers will meet in the periodical room of the library, and the finance ministers will meet in what is that little rotunda where the computer card catalog is. But in order to meet there, they have to decide the doors were too wide, so they built new mahogany doors to narrow down the doors. They took out all the computer terminals and the shelves, and they took out that round circulation desk, and they built walls so you couldn't see into that the bibliographical room. And then they put in this $135,000 table in the periodical room. And then they put back into the bibliography room translators booth, so the translators by closed-circuit TV could watch the various people and translate into the proper language to their person what people were saying. And then the foreign ministers are going to meet in what is now the periodical room that's very near where the circulation desk is. But they decided that it didn't. First place, there were too many magazines. It looked too much like a library. So they took out the shelves and they moved all the periodicals and so forth. And they brought in a bunch of famous big leather-bound books like, London Parliamentary Record and so forth to make it look kind of like a scholarly library. And then they thought it looks terrible to have a circulation desk, and they didn't like that mezzanine. So they built a new wall, the complete length of the mezzanine, and they sheetrocked it and put in mahogany wood and molding and so forth so they could just kind of shut off that whole mezzanine because they thought it looked too much like a library. And in fact, it did look like a library. So anyway, so they renovated that in the card catalog room, and they totally renovated this and put in all kinds of curtains so people couldn't see in. And then they put in another round table. So Monday afternoon, for about 2 hours, these 3 tables will be used. $315,000. Now, Tuesday, the day of the big meeting, they're all going to meet in the reading room of Herring Hall. But first, they decided that each head of delegation had to have an office both in Lovett Hall and in Herring Hall, because the heads of delegation are going to be arriving in 7-minute intervals, beginning with the person at the bottom of the sort of protocol list, and that's poor old Jacques Delors of the Economic Union. So he's going to arrive at 12:46. And then every 7 minutes later, another person will come. Kai-Fu from Japan, and then Mitterrand, and then Bush. So it's all in. But see, so the people who get here first, they've got to kind of wait 20 minutes or so for all the rest are here. Well, the heads of delegation, they just can't stand under the sally port, and they can't stay in their limousine. So you've got to have an office for each head of state for that 20 minutes or so on Monday. But the offices have all got to be the same size, because if Germany, Helmut Kohl finds out that Andrade from Italy had a bigger room, it'd be a disaster. And so they said, well, you got to find 8 equal-sized rooms in Lovett Hall. Well, maybe Bush's can be bigger. We'll give you that because he's president. So they scrambled around and said, okay, we'll take you to the president's room and Zen's office and all these offices, and we'll take all the furniture out and all the drapes out and all the pictures and all that kind of stuff because it's not up to the quality of these heads of state. So we'll figure out how we can move walls and so forth, and we'll create President Bush will be in George Bush's president's office. We'll create 7 equal-size offices. We'll put in new drapes and new rugs, and we'll bring in new furniture and new knickknacks and pictures, and we'll have 7 equal-size offices for the 20 minutes or so before Monday. But then on Tuesday and Wednesday, they're going to be meeting in the business school. And so we've got to have equal-size offices. Well, honey, what do you get? They realized, oh, they got classrooms. But those classrooms had theater seating. You can hardly have an office with a slanted floor. So they ripped out the floor, they took it back down to the concrete, and then they put in a new floor that was level. And then they put a wall down the middle of every classroom so that the classroom became 2 equal-size offices. And so they created 7 equal-size offices out of classrooms. Again, President Bush's office was up a little bit bigger on the 2nd floor. And then they put in the new floor, took out the blackboards, and they fixed it all up and brought in furniture and chairs and potted plants and pictures on the wall and knickknacks. They really looked nice. And then they noticed that long hallway in the business school. It was a brand new building then. It wasn't scuffed up or anything. It just won an AIA National Award. But they noticed that there were, what are the things you put books in? What do you call those things? Lockers. There were lockers. They thought, oh, these lockers just look too institutional. Looks too much like a school. So they built a sheetrock wall the full length of the hallway, and they put in chair molding and mahogany and painted up, redid those, so you couldn't see any of those, ugly lockers. I said to the White House man, this to me seems kind of absurd. He said, well, it may seem absurd to you, but so, we have to have it at the level of diplomat. If you think this is silly, you should see what they did at Versailles. I don't know, I kind of feel like Versailles probably didn't take a lot of, Anyway, that was what he said. This is a real dark photo that I took. That is what used to be the Weiss loading dock. Because a White House person went up to what was going to be President Bush's office in the far end of the business hearing hall and looked out, and all of a sudden his eyes were assaulted by that Weiss loading dock. There's kind of a concrete loading dock, and they brought in food and so forth. They thought, oh, it just wouldn't do for President Bush if he were to look out the window in the 10, 15 minutes to see this loading dock. That's not presidential. And so they dug up the driveway. They put in sod, they planted bushes, they walled across that loading dock area, they put in wrought iron, and for 3 days the Weiss loading dock was just a beautiful little piece. And that's my dark photo. You can't quite see it. But if you could just take my word for it. Right there is the Weiss loading dock. A huge controversy about President Bush and George Rupp's office was they really believed that President Rupp's restroom was not up to speed. And they asked Rice to redo the restroom. And by this time, Carl was pretty feisty, Carl McDowell. And so those who know Carl can imagine this. And so it became quite heated. And so finally what they decided was Rice would buy a new toilet seat, and the White House could put in some new wallpaper. So, we don't even know if George Bush saw this, but it was possible.